The folder was thin. That was the first thing veteran Capitol Hill reporters noticed when Chip Roy walked into that hearing room. Not a binder, not a stack of briefing materials with color-coded tabs and sticky notes running up the sides. A single thin manila folder, carried under one arm, set quietly on the desk in front of him without ceremony. Those who knew Roy understood immediately what that meant. Thin folders from Chip Roy are the most dangerous kind. Pam Bondi took her seat at the witness table with the practiced composure of a woman who had survived harder rooms than this one. She adjusted her microphone with a precise, rehearsed motion. She folded her hands on the table in front of her. She smiled once, briefly, professionally, toward the cameras positioned along the back wall. Her team had spent days preparing her. Talking points memorized, statistics loaded, anticipated attack lines neutralized in advance. Every aggressive questioner on the committee had been profiled and pre-answered. What nobody on that preparation team had accounted for was a congressman who had spent 3 consecutive weeks reading nothing but 3 million Department of Justice documents, and who had found, buried inside page after page of financial records, travel logs, encrypted communications, and wire transfer confirmations. A single name that changed the entire architecture of the hearing before a single question was asked. She thought this would be manageable. She was catastrophically wrong. Roy didn't open with context. He didn't warm up the room with procedural pleasantries or establish partisan framing. He opened with a name. Attorney General, he began, his voice carrying the deliberate, unhurried cadence of a man who has already won and simply hasn't told anyone yet. I want to talk about a woman named Karina Shuliak. The room shifted in the space of a single breath. Reporters' fingers froze above keyboards. A Democratic staffer in the third row visibly stopped writing mid-sentence. 3 camera operators adjusted their angles simultaneously, swinging toward the witness table, with the instinctive precision of people who recognize the exact moment a hearing becomes something different from what it was scheduled to be. Bondi's expression didn't break, but it recalibrated, a micro-adjustment most viewers watching live would have missed entirely. A slight tightening behind the eyes, the kind of recalibration that happens when a name lands inside a room, and the person hearing it understands immediately that the conversation has just moved into territory that was supposed to remain unmapped. She was Jeffrey Epstein's girlfriend, Roy continued, his voice still level, still measured, each word placed with the careful precision of a forensic technician handling evidence. She received the last phone call he ever made from that prison cell. And according to his will, signed just 2 days before his death, she was set to inherit $100 million. He paused. One full beat of silence. My question is very simple. Where is she right now? Bondi opened her mouth. Roy didn't wait. Because I've been reading the DOJ files, he said, cutting across her response like a blade through still water. 3 million documents, and her name, Karina Shuliak, appears over 40,000 times. He lifted the thin folder from the desk. He turned it deliberately toward the cameras so that every journalist, every staffer, every American watching from home could register the gesture. 40,000 times, Attorney General. Emails, wire transfers, travel logs, property records, encrypted communications. This woman was not a background figure. She was threaded through every layer of this operation. He set the folder down with the quiet finality of a man closing a door. Has she ever been formally questioned? What happened next was not a pause. Pauses happen in congressional hearings constantly. The brief gathering of thoughts, the reaching for water, the shuffling of papers that buys a witness 3 seconds to locate a prepared answer. Washington runs on managed pauses. Officials are trained to deploy them strategically, to use the microsecond gap between question and answer as a pressure valve, releasing tension before it builds into something visible on camera. This was not that. This was silence. Full, unbroken, structural silence in a room containing over 200 people. The kind of silence that has physical weight, the kind that presses down on everyone present simultaneously and forces every person in the chamber to confront the same uncomfortable reality at the same moment. Bondi's jaw moved, the muscles along her jawline visibly contracted and released, the involuntary biomechanical signature of a person searching for words that aren't arriving in the sequence she needs them. I cannot speak to the specifics of. Roy leaned forward. His voice didn't rise. It dropped, lower, slower, the particular vocal register of a man who is prepared for exactly this moment and has absolutely no intention of allowing it to pass without full accounting. Attorney General, that is a yes or no question. Bondi's hands pressed flat against the surface of the table. Her knuckles, and this detail matters, this is the detail that cameras captured and analysts would replay for days afterward, whitened slightly under the pressure. The Department of Justice takes all relevant. Roy cut her off clean. No theatrics, no raised voice, just the surgical application of the most devastating four-word sentence available to any congressional questioner who has done their homework and knows the answer before asking the question. So, that's a no. 3 camera operators zoomed in simultaneously. A Democratic staffer in the back row put down her pen entirely and simply stared at the witness table, because Chip Roy hadn't asked a trap question. He hadn't constructed an elaborate hypothetical designed to make Bondi choose between 2 bad options. He hadn't deployed procedural jargon or obscure regulatory language to corner her on a technicality. He had asked the most elementary, unavoidable question any American citizen with a basic understanding of how federal investigations are supposed to work would ask. Has she been questioned? And the Attorney General of the United States, the woman with 115,000 employees, a $40 billion budget, and the full institutional weight of federal law enforcement behind her, could not say yes, after 40,000 mentions, after years of investigation, after 3 million documents entered into the public record. The answer was not yes. The answer was the silence that followed. To understand why that silence landed with the force of a structural detonation, you have to understand what Roy had actually found inside those 3 million documents, because the story of Karina Shuliak is not a conspiracy theory assembled from anonymous sources and forum speculation. It is a documented architecture of financial control, institutional manipulation, and deliberate dependency construction that federal investigators had cataloged in extraordinary detail, and then, according to everything presented in that hearing room, apparently decided never to fully pursue. Shuliak arrived in the United States in 2009. She was 20 years old. A dental student from Minsk, Belarus, with no established connection to American institutions, no independent financial resources, and no framework for navigating one of the most complex immigration and educational systems on Earth. Epstein introduced himself using a false name, Vasily, a deliberate concealment of his identity as a man with a documented criminal history that would have immediately disqualified him from the kind of relationship he was constructing. He paid for her flights. He arranged her visa. He built around her a financial dependency so architecturally complete, so systematically comprehensive in its scope, that extraction from it would have required not just personal courage, but institutional support that was never offered. Then he built her a career. When Shuliak applied to Columbia University's dental school and received a rejection letter, Epstein made a phone call, then a donation, $100,000 directed specifically to the dean's personal research fund. Study guides materialized. A transfer exception was quietly granted inside the administrative machinery of one of the most prestigious academic institutions in the country. She was admitted. He paid every dollar of her tuition. But buried deeper inside those DOJ documents, deeper than the admissions manipulation, deeper than the financial records, deeper than the visa arrangements, Roy had found something that transformed the entire narrative into something more disturbing than a story of exploitation. On Little Saint, James Epstein's private island, federal investigators had documented the existence of a fully equipped dental examination room. Not a medicine cabinet, not a first aid station, a room, a dental chair, clinical lighting, professional equipment. On an island with no hospital, no clinic, no public medical facility of any kind. An island accessible only by private aircraft or private vessel. An island that existed entirely outside the administrative and oversight frameworks of any functioning government. And the only person in Epstein's documented inner circle with the professional training to operate that room was Karina Shuliak. Roy looked up from his folder at that moment. His voice carried no dramatic inflation, no performance. Just the flat, precise delivery of a man reading a charge sheet into the permanent congressional record. Attorney General, who was that room built for? Bondi's jaw tightened. I'm not in a position to. Who used it? I cannot. Was she ever in it? The question hit the chamber like a door slamming in an otherwise completely silent building. Every person in that room felt it physically. The sudden atmospheric compression of a question that connects documented evidence to a conclusion nobody in an official capacity had ever been willing to state directly on the record. Bondi did not answer. She could not answer. And in the forensic architecture of high-stakes congressional oversight, the inability to answer a direct factual question about a documented federal investigation is itself an answer, the most devastating answer available. Roy let the silence run for 5 full seconds. Then he moved on, slowly, deliberately, like a man who understood he had already secured everything he came for and was now simply building the record around it. The financial architecture Roy proceeded to lay before the committee wasn't circumstantial. It wasn't inference or extrapolation from incomplete records. It was a documented transaction-by-transaction reconstruction of how a man who had already been prosecuted once for sexual offenses used institutional access, financial leverage, and bureaucratic manipulation to build a parallel life around a woman 2 decades younger, and then systematically extended that financial protection to her entire family. Epstein wired $15,000 to Juliak's mother in January 2013, $25,000 to her father in 2014. Juliak herself transferred an additional $25,000 to her parents in 2016, informing Epstein by email and attaching the wire transfer confirmation, a detail that places her not as a passive recipient of his financial architecture, but as an active participant in the communication chain surrounding it. Belarusian property records, cross-referenced against those wire transfers, suggest the funds were used to purchase an apartment in Drozdzi, an exclusive Minsk suburb historically associated with government officials, senior bureaucrats, and public figures with access to protected administrative infrastructure. Roy's summary of that sequence was delivered without editorial commentary. He didn't need any. He wasn't just controlling her, Roy said, his voice carrying the particular quietness of a man who understands that documented facts require no amplification. He was buying her entire family's silence. Then came the visa situation, the detail that transformed the story from one of financial exploitation into something that touched the administrative machinery of American immigration infrastructure directly. By 2013, Juliak's student visa had expired. Epstein's response was not conventional. It was not a lawyer filing extension paperwork or a formal application for adjusted status. It was the arrangement of a sham marriage to a woman named Jennifer, who had been in a relationship with Kimball Musk, Elon Musk's brother, a connection Epstein himself had reportedly facilitated. The marriage took place in October 2013. A green card followed. Then, in 2018, full United States citizenship. Then divorce. Epstein's attorneys celebrated the outcome with a message that Roy read aloud, word for word, directly into the congressional record, with the particular deliberateness of a man who understands that certain sentences need no interpretive framing to land with their full weight. Now that she's an American, you should throw her a big old party. The room did not react. That was worse than any reaction could have been, because in the accumulated silence of 200 people processing that sentence simultaneously, something had crystallized, the recognition that what Roy was describing was not a series of isolated transactions or coincidental connections, but a documented, multi-year, institutionally penetrating operation to manufacture an untouchable American life for a woman whose name appeared 40,000 times in the files of a federal investigation that had apparently never asked her a single question under oath. Roy closed the folder. This was the moment he had been building toward from the first second he walked into that room. Every documented transaction, every cross-referenced property record, every admission manipulation and visa arrangement and wire transfer had been laid down not as the destination but as the road, a forensically constructed path leading directly to a single fact that no amount of procedural language, institutional deflection, or administrative complexity could neutralize. Attorney General, Roy said, his voice dropping to something quieter and more dangerous than anything that had preceded it. The particular register of a man who no longer needs volume because the architecture of what he has built speaks at a frequency that fills the room without amplification. On August 10, 2019, the morning Jeffrey Epstein died in that federal prison cell, Bureau of Prisons records confirmed that one outgoing call was made, one call to the outside world. He let the silence stretch for a full 3 seconds. That call went to Karina Shuliak. Nobody moved. Because everyone in that chamber, every reporter, every staffer, every senator, every camera operator, understood in the same instant what that single documented fact meant. In the final minutes of Jeffrey Epstein's life, with everything that was about to happen already in motion, with the full weight of whatever he knew and whatever he feared pressing down on him inside a federal detention facility, the one person he chose to reach was her, not a lawyer, not a family member, not an associate who could have activated protective measures or alerted institutional allies. Her. "I want to know," Roy said, each word placed with the care of a man constructing the final line of a permanent historical record, what was said in that call, whether it was recorded, whether anyone in the Department of Justice has ever listened to it, and whether Karina Shuliak has ever been asked, under oath, what he told her. Bondi's face had gone very still, not the composed stillness of a prepared witness managing a difficult question. The different kind, the kind that is controlled collapse, the visible effort of a person maintaining surface architecture while the interior structure processes something it was not equipped to receive. "I will need to look into that." Her voice was barely above a murmur. Roy nodded once. Slowly, with the particular economy of motion that belongs to a man who has already secured everything he came for. 30 days, he said, in writing. Everyone around Jeffrey Epstein eventually ran. That was Roy's closing framework, delivered not with the thundering indignation of a political performance, but with the quiet, inexorable cadence of a forensic conclusion being entered into the permanent record of American oversight history. The clock is ticking on these questions. Pam Bondi is gone from that office now. The thin folder Roy carried into that hearing room has been entered into the congressional record. The 40,000 document references don't disappear because the hearing ended. The last phone call doesn't become less significant because nobody in an official capacity has chosen to examine it directly. What Chip Roy did in that chamber was not perform outrage. He did not duck and weave through partisan talking points or deploy the standard congressional theater of aggressive questioning designed to generate clips rather than accountability. He built a forensic trap out of documented federal evidence, walked the Attorney General of the United States into the center of it, and asked the simplest possible question. Has she been questioned? The answer was silence. And in Washington, silence is never empty. Sometimes silence is policy. Sometimes silence is protection, and sometimes silence tells you, with more precision than any leaked document or classified reading room transcript ever could, exactly where the boundaries of the administrative state are drawn, and exactly whose names fall on the protected side of them. Chip Roy left that hearing room carrying the same thin folder he walked in with. The questions stayed behind. They're still there, and they're not going anywhere. Associates distanced themselves. Employees claimed ignorance. Enablers disappeared into the administrative fog of legal privilege and sealed documents and decades of carefully constructed deniability. She did not. She stayed. She was named the primary heir. She received the last call. Her name dominates 40,000 documents, appearing more frequently in the federal investigative record than Ghislaine Maxwell, the woman who was prosecuted, convicted, and is currently serving a federal prison sentence. And she is living her life somewhere in this country, today, having never answered a single question under oath about any of it. "Who made that decision?" Roy said, looking directly at Bondi for the last time. "And who does it protect?" Bondi said she would look into it. She never answered the question. And that non-answer, that institutionally managed, procedurally cushioned, bureaucratically upholstered non-answer, became something the administrative state cannot easily walk back, because it now lives in the congressional record, time-stamped, attributed, permanent. Roy wasn't trying to prove guilt inside that hearing room. He understood that congressional hearings are not courtrooms, and the rules of evidence that govern criminal conviction don't apply to the architecture of public accountability. What he was doing was something more strategically sophisticated and ultimately more dangerous to the institutions he was examining. He was exposing selective silence, the gap between what federal investigative infrastructure is capable of pursuing and what it apparently chose, in this case, not to pursue. The invisible line, the oversight loophole that exists not in any statute or regulatory framework, but in the discretionary space between what investigators are required to do and what they are directed to do, between a name that appears 40,000 times in the public record and a sworn deposition that has never happened. That gap is the scandal, Not what Karina Shuliak did or didn't do. Not what she knew or didn't know. Not what was said in that final phone call on the morning of August 10th, 2019. The scandal is the documented, institutional, apparently deliberate decision that none of those questions were worth asking in a formal legal setting. In 2025, Karina Shuliak stood in a Columbia University graduation ceremony. She smiled. She laughed on camera. The video is still online. 3,000 people watched it. Not one of them was a federal prosecutor asking her to raise her right hand. That is not an oversight. That is a decision.